What's your reflection or your thought about just sort of observing this rising populism, this rising illiberalism, and this notion of group conflict in a way, and leaders being rewarded for serving their ethnic group as opposed to the interests of others? Yeah.
I think one thing to recognize is that that is a form of cooperation. Mm-hmm. It's just a cooperation where the benefits are really directed towards a much smaller group of people. There's an analogy to trusts and cartels that are organizations that arise to cooperate within the marketplace for their benefit at the expense of the consumer. And the United States has put together a robust antitrust institutions and laws and so on in order to combat that. Something the founder of this institution would know something about.
He got his comeuppance. Well, we'll talk about it.
He did. But regardless, we do something about that kind of cooperation. Yeah. The same psychology, the same tools that we have to do good for everybody are sometimes co-opted to do good for just a small group. And I think that can be very dangerous, and we are seeing a lot of it. Sometimes we can combat that using kind of the inverse tools of the ones that we just introduced. To some extent, you can reduce the benefits to engaging in that kind of cooperation. You can introduce lots of excuses and kind of muddy the waters. You can send messages that mess up expectations and to some extent make it harder for the group to coordinate on its cooperative efforts. But to some extent, it's going to require more than that. It's going to require really stripping the incentives that leader has and aligning the incentives of that subgroup with other groups. And that's a different toolkit and very difficult. I imagine that you can speak to that.
Yeah. Well, I think the sort of rising nationalism and populism in particular, there's a very dangerous trend because populism is essentially anti-democratic. Because at the heart of democracy is pluralism, and populists are allergic to pluralism, and they make a certain moral claim that they're the ones who represent the people. And the reason why I think it's dangerous to democracy, and because the more power they have, you have the potential for authoritarianism, and then they can decide which people in this polity are not part of the people. And it's up to them to decide who constitutes the people. So it's a very dangerous phenomenon. I think at the international level, one way that you can try to counter populism is through effective multilateralism. It is not enough to say we need multilateralism, but we need to show that multilateralism is effective. And that means understanding the root causes of why lots of people, huge segments in populations in different parts of the world feel as if they've been abandoned. And when you understand why they feel they've been abandoned, you begin to put multilateral programs, multilateral activities, plans to address their needs, and they feel that multilateralism is making a difference in their lives. I think that's one way you begin to counter it at the international level. But it's not, in order for multilateralism to be effective, it has to be networked. So the UN in the city has to cooperate closely with other international entities like the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, other agencies in the UN system like the World Health Organization, which has been dealing with the pandemic. You have to work with other agencies. And it's also critical to work with regional organizations such as the African Union, the EU, the OAS, and ASEAN in Southeast Asia. But you have to also go beyond sort of the networked nature of multilateralism. It also has to be inclusive. So it means bringing in non-state actors like think tanks, Carnegie, working with the private sector, working with business, working with civil society, working with universities, so that you have an inclusive form of multilateralism. But I also do think that in an era of rising nationalism and populism, it's really, really important to affirm that global institutions and universal norms are not threats to particular identities or particular interests.